Hello, my dear. Gavin has drafted me in to help to see if I can expand your knowledge, try and shed some extra light, try and clarify situations. And what I thought I would do is I would use the rather excellent document that Gavin has produced about how a car works. A lot of people understand it but then get confused with the numbers, so I thought I'd go through it, see what I can do to help clarify, obviously on the high level. So let's have a look here. Over here we've got how a car works. Okay, so it is very important that you separate an engine from a car. Think of them as two completely separate things. So over here we have an engine, and then over here we have a car. Now, a car, yes, it is a big box. It's got seats in it and all sorts, but it is basically underneath. You've got the wheels of a car, then you've got a gearbox, and then you've got half a clutch that connects to the gearbox. And on an engine, what you've got is a big box that makes lots of banging noises and burns fuel, and it has another spinning disc that comes out of it. Together, those two parts make one clutch, but you have one individual part attached to each of the other components. So this part is connected to the engine and this part is connected to the gearbox. If we have a look at a car, here is a car. Remember, nothing to do with an engine. You could push this soapbox, you could push it down the hill by using a friend. He brought a friend with him. Jolly. Alternatively, you could use gravity. Well, you get out and push yourself, you know. There's lots of options of moving that down a hill, and we don't need an actual engine in order to do that. Let's talk about the engine. The engine is basically like a fireplace. So it has a minimum operating speed of about 800 RPM, and that is known as idle. If, when I say RPM, I'm meaning revolutions per minute, or revs. So it's 800 RPM, and that's where an engine will just rest. You know, when you turn an engine on, you just leave it. It's idling at 800 RPM. If it gets down to 600 RPM, then the engine will stall. Right, now, the thing that keeps the engine running is an idle valve, and that is a butler, for want of a better word. I have butler inside the engine. He's called Jeeves in my instance, and his job is there to keep squirting diesel into the engine, and it keeps the engine running. Okay, now, if he didn't squirt diesel into the engine, then effectively a fire inside would go out. The engine operates at greater or equal to 800 RPM, and the fire gets bigger inside by squirting more fuel into it. The more fuel we fire into it, the bigger the fire gets and the more explosions and the faster the engine spins around, and that is the responsibility of the driver. So there I am with my license. So I push the accelerator and I create all the revs in this section here. If I take my foot off the accelerator, the revs will drop back down to 800 RPM, where Jeeves takes over and keeps the engine running for me. Jolly good, Jeeves. But if we get down to 600, then we stall the engine. That's basically the engine done. Let's move on to the gearbox. If I can find one, there it is. Marvellous. Right, now the gearbox. Shall we zoom in a little bit on that? Here are some facts for my manual car, my Ford Focus. Okay, and it does vary from car to car. So this is the disc that we saw, half of a clutch that is connected to a gearbox, and the other side of the gearbox fires out to the wheels. So a fact for you is, in my car, and it varies, if I get this running at 800 RPM, so if that's spinning at 800 RPM and I'm in first gear, I get 5 miles per hour at the wheel. And in my car, it is 5 times the gear number. So here it's running at 800 RPM. If I was in first, I get 5, but if I was in second gear, I'd get 10. In third, I'd get 15. You guessed it, if I was in fourth, I'd get 20. Right. Now remember, this has got nothing to do with the engine. This is just purely up here, the miles per hour, gearbox and the clutch. So we're talking about the RPM here on the clutch. Okay, so here we are. This is fact because they are all connected. If I was in first gear, here's my 5 miles per hour at 800. So if I was doing 2.5 miles an hour, so half the speed, the clutch would be rotating at half the speed, and if we were stationary, it would be stationary. And if I double my speed on the car, I would double the speed of the clutch. Equally though, if I doubled the speed of the clutch again, that in turn would make my car double in speed. So as you can see, this is connected to that via this. So if that stops, that stops. And if that travels fast, that travels fast. Okay, so they're actually really connected. And here we have another diagram, because I'm splendid like that. So as you can see, as the speeds increase, there is a direct correlation between the speed at the wheel and the speed of the clutch. Right. Now we all know that a gearbox basically just takes a speed in. There we go. So we take that speed in, multiplied by the gear, and I get a speed out, or vice versa, going back the other way. That's all a gearbox does. There is, inside the gearbox, you normally have this connection here. In my car, I've actually got 6, so reverse is actually out here. However, this line in the middle is neutral, and that is where they basically take a cog out of the gearbox. So even though that's spinning, there is no cog in here, and therefore the power does not get to the wheels. So it's basically like taking the cog out, or a chain off a bicycle, for instance. I just want to go high level on you. Here we have a diagram. So we zoom in on that bit. There we go. Right, so this part is the engine. And in my car, because it's a diesel, it doesn't spin very fast. Here we have a red zone, which is where the engine would stall. So it's below 600 RPM. 800 is where idle. Anything above this is up to me to push the accelerator to put the extra fuel in. And then when I get to this section here, I'm basically getting to the point where the engine is going a little bit too fast, and I run the risk of all the internal components becoming external, which I don't want. Here we have a clutch, and a clutch joins the engine to the car. And you can separate that. Now when I say the clutch, what I mean is a clutch pedal. Because remember, there is half a clutch on the engine, so you could think of a clutch sat here. And there is the other half of the clutch sat there. So we have a clutch, which is 2 spinning discs, and you have a clutch pedal, which operates the discs. So this section in the middle here, this is the pedal, and these are the 2 discs. So what I'm saying to you is, if I pushed fuel into the engine and I got the engine rotating at 2400 RPM, then the clutch here on the engine would be spinning at that speed. And if it is not connected to the car, then obviously it won't affect the car. It must be connected in order for it to affect the car. And equally, the car itself has a clutch spinning here. And if it is separated from the engine, then the car itself could be, if I was in first gear for instance, I could be shooting down the road at say 15 miles an hour, and what that would correspond to is about 2400 RPM on the car. Remember, the engine itself could be switched off at this point. It's nothing to do with the engine, it's just the car. So there is a speed of a clutch connected to the car, and there is a speed of a clutch connected to an engine, and the clutch pedal joins that to that. And as we can see from this rather splendid diagram, here we have all these gears, and it's just a grid. So this is 800 RPM, and it's 5 times the gear number in my car. So at 800 RPM, if I was doing 5 miles in 5th gear, then I would be doing 25 miles an hour. Equally, if I went to 5 times my speed, so I went to 4000 RPM, then I would be doing 5 times the speed. So if that was 800 RPM, that would be 4,000, because that's 5 times 800. Here we go. See? It's just a correlation. So that is a fifth of that. That is 5 times that. And it just depends upon what gear you're in. And that's how a gearbox works. It's just you pick the gear, and for however fast the vehicle is traveling, that would give you a different revolution on the clutch. So let's take these lines here, for example. 25 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour, 25, 25, 25. Now if I was in first gear, then my revolutions would be 4,000 RPM on the car. Okay, 25 mile an hour here in second gear would be about 2,000. Is that roughly 2,000? 25 miles an hour here is roughly 1,003, all the way up to here, where 25 miles an hour is in fact 800 RPM. So as you can see, the speed of this rotating matches with the speed of the car and the gear that you have picked. So if I was in fourth gear, it would be that speed. First gear, it would be that speed. And then so here you could imagine a big spinning disc connected to this blue line here, and it just correlates. Now the issue comes when you start incorporating the engine. But as you can see, if here on the car, remember the car separate from the engine, if I wanted to stop the car and just go to 0 miles per hour, then the speed of the clutch would be 0. And it wouldn't be a problem. I could just put the brake on and stop the car, couldn't I? Providing that I am separated from the engine. The clutch. Now, here's your 3 pedals, clutch on the left. And remember what I've said to you before already, is that the clutch pedal just operates the clutch. And here it is, it separates these 2 pieces. One piece connected to the engine and one piece connected to the gearbox. Remember, if that is rotating and you are in a gear, separate from neutral of course, then this is rotating. They are connected. Okay, now the clutch pedal is a percentage pedal. Okay, now I know a lot of people are worried about percentages, but you don't need to worry about it too much. Right, let's have a look at this. You can have anything. If you push the clutch pedal down, so the pedal goes all the way down, then you have a 0% bite. And then when you take a foot off the clutch altogether, you have a 100% bite. You only get a bite when the 2 clutch plates join. And when they're actually touching, that is a bite. If you've got fresh air in the middle, that is no bite at all. So here we have the pedal is all the way down, we have a 0% bite. You can start to bring it up a little bit, it's still a 0% bite. Bring it up more, still 0. But here they touch. If they are lightly touching, you have a 1% bite. If you bring it up a bit more, then you might have a 5 or a 10% bite. And when you take your foot fully off the clutch, then you have a 100% bite. I hope that's nice and clear for you. So, how does this all work then? Here we have a diagram. Remember, the bite is the percentage of a difference. I've got 2 diagrams here, as you can see. Remember, this document is on my website, so you can read it to your heart's content. This is a simplified version, but I will discuss it anyway. You have an engine, and it's idling at 800 RPM. Jeeves is keeping the engine running at 800 RPM for us, and you come along and, well, let's say the car's stationary, right? So the car is stationary, so the wheel is 0 miles per hour, therefore the clutch connected to the engine is at 0 miles an hour because we're stationary in first gear. You come along and you start to bring your clutch up and you get a 10% bite. What that does is it transfers 10% of the difference in speeds between the speed of the engine and the speed of the gearbox. And in this instance, the difference is 800, so then 10% of 800 is 80, and what happens is we transfer 80 across into the gearbox. Right. Now, just keep your foot still on the pedal at this point. Don't move it, just there, just hold it at 10%. This diagram that I'm showing you is a simplified version of what is actually happening, just for ease of mathematics. I'll come to the actual figures. We have taken 10%, which in theory means we have taken 80 from the engine, which means the revs would drop down to 720 because we've taken 80. But good old Jeeves, he just squirts an extra bit harder and he puts the fuel back in to bring the engine back up to 800 for us. So we perceptibly don't see any difference. The engine just stays at 800. If I just take 80 RPM and I transfer it across into the gearbox, we already know from what I was saying earlier that if this rotates at 800 RPM, we are doing 5 miles an hour. So therefore, if it's doing a tenth of 800, we are doing a tenth of 5 miles an hour. Do you see? So 80 RPM equals half a mile an hour. Now if I transferred another 80 across, it would be doing 160. So therefore we would gain another half a mile an hour. And another 80 across, we gain another half a mile an hour, and another 80, and another, and so on. And as this clutch increases in speed, the speed of the wheel increases. This is the actual figures, because of course we're talking about a 10% difference. And what happens is you've got the speed of the engine, the speed of the clutch on the gearbox, and you touch them, you get 10%. 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. Of course, until they get to the same speed. And when they're at the same speed, 10% of nothing is still nothing, so therefore the gearbox does not get faster than the engine. Because those two speeds are the same, you can now take your foot off the clutch. So you have to go 10% bite, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, foot off the clutch. Oh, because 100% of the difference, which is still zero, is still zero. So therefore, the fact that your foot is now off the clutch doesn't make any difference. But what's crucially happening here is that the speed of the gearbox has now got up to the speed of the engine. That's the minimum speed of the engine. So now if we were to accelerate the engine, it would bring the gearbox up with it. And if we slowed the car down, it would bring the engine down. Now, provided we never let the engine get below 800 RPM, we don't have to disconnect the two. But if we want to slow the car down below 800 RPM, then we must disconnect and keep braking the car, but we need the engine running at 800. If we didn't do that and we brought the car down and this engine gets below 600 RPM, then it stalls. We don't want that. Issues. Off the clutch too soon. Now this all comes down to weight. Right, now, a car is very heavy. An engine, comparatively, is light. I mean, they're still jolly heavy things, but comparatively, they are lighter. Now, if you took your foot off the clutch too soon, by taking your foot off the clutch, you end up with a 100% bite, and you join the engine to the gearbox. That's the word. Well, if they are joined, they cannot be travelling at different speeds, and the heavy thing wins, doesn't it? So, for instance, if this lady here ran at that sumo wrestler, the sumo wrestler would win. Simple. So if you join something light to something heavy, the heavy thing wins. If we join that to that, this is what our options are. Car goes up to the engine speed. Well, you can't do that because the car's very heavy and physics says that the heavy thing wins. So engine speed goes down to the speed of the car. That's what would happen if you took your foot off the clutch. The problem now is that the speed is below 600 RPM, and if the engine gets below 600 RPM, it switches off. If the engine switches off, you now have basically turned the engine into an anchor, because you've just joined a massive stationary piece of metal, called the engine, to the car. So that would stop the car. The solution to this problem is you have to wait for the speed of the gearbox to get up to the speed of the engine. Then you can take your foot off the clutch because they will lock together. And now if you pick up the speed of one, it will carry the other, and so on and so forth. But if you want to slow it down, you must disconnect the engine. What if I want to drive at less than 5 miles per hour? Good question. Right, now, remember that the speed of the car is actually to do with what gear you're in and the speed that the clutch is spinning or the gearbox is spinning. It's got nothing to do with the engine particularly, right? So if I wanted my engine running at 800 RPM and I just joined the gearbox to the engine, the gearbox would go up to that. And if I was in first gear, I would be doing 5 miles an hour. So I don't want to do that. What I want to do is connect. And I want to get the gearbox up to, say, 1 mile an hour, which is about here-ish. Now, if I can get the gearbox up to here, and I stay connected to the engine, it'll just keep going. So what I have to do is push the clutch down to separate the two. But then the car itself might start to slow down, which means I need to reconnect just to keep the speed, but then disconnect so I don't keep going faster. So your pedal goes up and down as required, and you just connect and disconnect from the engine to try and keep the gearbox at this speed. And that's how you drive very slowly, such as if you were moving up to a junction, for instance. Bank account. Let's have a think about this. You could think of the revs in an engine like a bank account. It's all to do with energy or power, commodities, whatever you want. We could think of it in financial terms. But basically, when you're driving a car, it all works by basically a tug of war. The world around us is acting upon the car and it's trying to either accelerate us forwards or backwards. And then you've got an engine which is rotating a gearbox which is trying to pull the car around. Now, let's say gravity is pulling us down. This car, we're on a hill, it's pulling us down and therefore backwards. And it's pulling us with a force of 400 pounds. So let's pretend gravity has spent 400 pounds to pull us backwards. If we spent 400 pounds in forward motion, they would cancel each other out and the vehicle would stay still on the hill, as we have here. So 400 pounds in each direction, we are stationary. As soon as one of them wins over the other, you will either go forwards or backwards. So as I come up with the clutch, I spend a bit more. And if I spend more than the hill, I go forwards. If I don't spend as much, I go backwards. Spend the same amount, I stay completely stationary. It is exactly the same as a game of tug of war. When you think about a clutch and the accelerator, they are two separate things. And you could think of the accelerator as Gavin, who goes to work and he earns money, and he puts that money in a bank account. Okay, so here is the money that Gavin earns and he puts into the bank account. We could say, to go back to what we were talking about before, because remember this is basically an engine and an engine is a resource, well so is a bank account, it is a resource. So I could have an agreement with my bank manager, well Gavin could, not me obviously, I'm none the wiser. But Gavin could have an agreement with the bank manager that he will never get below £600 in the bank account. Never get below it, otherwise the bank manager can come round and shoot his cat or something. So, Jeeves has got a trust fund. He said, don't worry, I will ensure that the money in the bank account never gets below 800 RPM, and if it does, I will put some extra in to get it back up to 800. Gavin goes to work and he earns money. He puts more money into the bank account. So as you push the accelerator, you put money into the bank account, and the rev counter on the engine just purely displays how much money you have in the bank account. Paula, Gavin's wife, is the clutch. Now she spends a percentage of the bank account. If she were to go to a cash point, she can't say, give me £80. But what she can do is she can look at the balance in the bank account, say 800, and say, oh, I need 10% of that. So she goes, doot, doot, pum, and she gets £80. Jeeves would then immediately put that £80 back in because that's what he's paid for. But as you can see, the money that's in the bank account and the amount of money that Gavin's wife can spend are related in ways, but not directly. If Paula was going to spend money on acceleration and she needed to spend £400 on the hill, like here, she needed to spend that £400. If she only had £800 in the bank account, she would need a 50% bite. If she had twice as much money in the bank account, she would need half the bite size. If she had £4,000 in the bank account, she would need only 10% bite. Okay, so as you can see, the amount of money in the bank account does not necessarily mean that the vehicle will go faster when you are playing with a clutch. All it is a resource, and Paula can then decide to spend how much of the bank account she wants to spend. That's what's happening inside. Problem comes though, if you remember from the video that I showed you in the gearbox, is that Jeeves, if it gets below 800 RPM, he squirts extra hard, and if it gets below 600, he walks off in a strop because he's got cramp. Now, if I came along and I had £800 in my bank account, Paula needed a 50% bite to get that £400, that would mean that we take £400 out of the bank account, which means the bank account gets below 600, Jeeves has walked off in a strop, one dead cat, the cat gets shot. Okay, so we can't have a 50% bite. If you get too big a percentage and the revs drop below 600, the engine stalls. So you've got to be careful how big a bite you get, because if you get too big, you stall the engine. So it is actually a balancing act. You need to push money into the bank account, and remember, put money in first before you spend it. So you push the accelerator to raise your revs, then you get a bite to start spending, and the bite size that you get decides how much is transferred across to the gearbox, and that speeds up the rate of the gearbox. So the actual bite size actually equates to the speed that the vehicle accelerates, and if it's accelerating too fast for you, then push the clutch down a little bit because you've got too big a bite. Now, what about an automatic? An automatic is just a fancy way of transferring energy from the engine to the gearbox. The gearbox itself operates in pretty much the same manner, but it's the clutch that is the different thing in an automatic. In a manual, you have your clutch pedal that joins one disc to another. In an automatic, what you've actually got is a reservoir of oil and two fans. So here's a desk fan. Now we all know that if you have a fan, it rotates and it blows air that way. But if I were to turn it around and then go and blow into the fan, it would turn the fan backwards. You've probably tried this with desk fans yourself. So you just go and spin them up and they'll spin the opposite direction. In an automatic, basically you've got two fans. One fan connected to the engine, so as you spin up the engine, the fan gets faster, and that would blow oil across from the engine towards the gearbox. And inside there's another fan, and as the oil gets pushed across, it turns that fan, and that motion of turning the fan means that the gearbox turns, and therefore it all becomes exactly the same as the manual. So the difference is you've got a contained unit with oil in it, and as you spin up the engine, the oil gets pushed across, which turns another fan, effectively. Now if we then stopped the car so that the fan on the gearbox isn't rotating, it's just oil going through fans. So even if the engine spun up a bit, yes, the pressure would get bigger inside the clutch mechanism, but ultimately you're not causing any wear or tear because you're just sloshing oil around, so you're not burning the clutch away. So that's the advantage. But if you remember, there is no direct link. So in an automatic, you have to spin up the engine to build up the pressure to then start moving the fan or moving the gearbox. But in a manual, because they are physically touching, when you speed up the engine, it immediately speeds up the gearbox. So a manual car is more responsive than an automatic. And you've got lots of different settings that you can have. You've got your park, which basically locks the gearbox, stops it moving. You've got reverse neutral drive, sport. Sport, all that does, actually, that just holds a lower gear for you for a while, that's all. It doesn't make the engine any more powerful, it just changes what gear you pick. So whereas normally you might be driving along in second gear, it'll just stay in first for a bit longer. Because what that does is it raises the revs on the engine, and the higher the revs you have, the more power you have, and the more power you have, the faster you can accelerate. Kick down on an automatic, that's something that pops up in the theory test. Kick down is where you push the accelerator quickly to the floor. The car understands that you wish to accelerate quickly, and it changes down a couple of gears, kicks the revs up on the engine, and away you go. So kick down is where you go down gears to give you more power so that you accelerate faster. Lots of different types of gearbox, you can read that to your heart's content, I didn't want to go into that. Horses, gears, why, when. This comes into handy when you're trying to work out what's actually going on. Back to the engine. An engine basically is a source of power. And what happened was, years and years ago, when they first started off, they had to sell cars, or horseless carriages, which became shorter and be turned into a car, so it was a horseless carriage originally. To sell it to the locals, they worked out how much energy one horse did to move a known weight over a known distance, and that became known as 1 horsepower. So when they were selling their car to the local people, they would say this engine has the equivalent of 3 horsepower, which is why we measure engines in horsepower. The more horses you have, the more power you have. But of course you are limited to top speeds. Let's say a horse's top speed is 40 miles per hour. And then if you had a lot of horses, you could get to 40 very quickly, but you'd be limited to 40 miles an hour. But if you put that 40 miles an hour into a gearbox and had a 2 times multiplier, you could be doing 80 miles an hour. Put the horses on a treadmill, for instance. So, what you want to do is you want to think about the revolutions of the engine as a multiplier of horses. Let's say we have a 100 horsepower engine and it tops up at 5,000 RPM. That's the fastest that the engine could rotate. We could say therefore that at 1,000 RPM we have 20 horses, but at 5,000 we have 100 horses. So as the revs increase in speed, we get more horses, and what happens is the horses that you gain appear around the car. So you've got your car, there you go, there's a car, and if I have a few horses, they're around the car, and they're tied to the car. And what happens is, as you push the accelerator, you move the horses to the front of the car, and when you take your foot off the accelerator, they go to the back of the car. When you push the accelerator, they're very keen to get going, but when you take your foot off the accelerator, they're also very keen to stop. So maybe they're going to a Justin Bieber concert or something. And if I only push my accelerator halfway down, then I've got some at the front, some at the side, some at the back, and you can just move. This is how you could think of it. So the revs that you have on an engine mean that you have a number of horses. So if I had 3,000 RPM, I would have 60 horses in this example. But depending upon how I push the accelerator, I decide where those 60 horses go. So if I push my accelerator all the way to the floor when I have low revs, I put just 20 horses on the front of the car. But as the car gets faster, the revolutions of the engine increase. That creates more horses. So all of a sudden I get loads and loads and loads of horses. And the more horses you have, the faster the car then accelerates. So as your revs increase, your rate of acceleration improves. Problem is though, just like real horses, you get power that you can use, which is a good thing, but you have to run them, so it costs you food in hay, in this instance diesel, but you also get more emissions. So horses fart a lot, cars emit CO2 and such forth, and there's noise pollution. A lot of horses in a field are all frolicking around, being idiots, and they make a lot of noise. One horse in a field is very quiet. Just like a car, if you have a car at a low rev just going past you, it goes, you can hardly hear it. But when you've got a car screaming, you can hear it from miles away. So the higher the rev, the more noise pollution we get as well. So you get more pollution, it costs you in your pocket because you're burning more fuel, but you do get more power. So you've got to decide how many horses you need to do the thing that you want to do. If you were just driving along a road, it was a flat bit of road, you only needed a few horses just to beat the wind resistance or the rolling resistance of the vehicle. You could then decide, well, I only need 10 horses, for instance. So we go back to there. If I was at 1000 RPM, I have 20 horses, but I would only push my foot halfway down on the accelerator to move 10 to the front of the car, you see, and then that would beat everything I need. Of course, I could come down the road at 5000 RPM and I have 100 horses. But why bring 100 if I only need 10? I'm just burning extra fuel, making more pollution, making more noise. Equally, if I was going up a steep hill and maybe I needed 40 horses just to pull me up the hill, if I went into a gear that equated to low revs, then I wouldn't have enough horses to get up the hill and the car would just get slower and slower and slower until eventually I would stall the engine. So we pick a gear, and if you remember earlier on the diagram, the gear meant that the clutch on the gearbox spun at a certain speed, and if I join that to the engine, it makes the engine spin at the same speed. But the engine, now it is spinning at that speed, creates horses. And so I can utilize those horses and push it through the gearbox, and away we go. So on a flat 10 horsepower, I could only push the accelerator a little bit if I needed to. I could bring a lot of horses, but then I'd only have to push the accelerator a teeny weeny bit, but it's very, very wasteful. The same thing applies when you're going downhill. It's known as engine braking. So when you take your foot off the accelerator, the revs are set at whatever rev you supplied, but they will try to drop back down to 800 RPM where Jeeves takes over. So that is the engine slowing, and a byproduct of the engine slowing is that if it is connected to the car, if the engine slows, it also tries to slow the car. So therefore the engine is braking the car effectively, but only down to idle at 800 RPM. At that point it will just pull you at the corresponding speed depending upon what gear you're in, 5, 10, 15 miles an hour. But engine braking is a very useful thing. So if you had a 50 horsepower hill trying to accelerate you down, this gear would give me this rev, which would give me this many horses. Depending upon how I push the accelerator, I can use some of them and it will give me a good or bad result. So in this instance I needed 50 horsepower. The only time I'm going to get 50 horsepower is if I was in first gear, because second gear would only give me 48, and away we go. You could do it for an overtake, for instance. If I stayed in a low gear, I would get a lot of horses, which would be fantastic for acceleration, but I would be limited by my top speed on the engine, so second would be better. So I get a lot of horses, and as I accelerate, this would get faster and faster and faster, so I'd get even more and more horses, so my acceleration would get better, and I'd go out and then whoosh past the car and back in. If, however, I had a high gear, because a lot of people think I want to go fast, go to a high gear, all it does is the higher the gear, the lower your revs, the fewer horses you have, and your acceleration will be terrible. So high gears are only good when you have attained the high speed that you want, because what they do is they reduce your revs, and if you reduce your revs you burn less fuel. So we use high gears to cruise at higher top speeds, but we use the low gears to get there quickly. Brakes. Brakes slow the wheels. The brakes are on the wheels, they're not on the engine. If I brake the car itself, then the speed of the car will slow and slow and slow and slow and slow until I come to a stop. One of the questions in the theory test is that you're going down a steep hill, you realise that your brakes aren't working as well. Should you go down to a lower or higher gear? Now, as we have discovered already, if we go down a gear, we get higher revs. Higher revs gives us more engine braking if we were going downhill by taking our foot off the accelerator, because we tie the horses to the back of the car, which means we need to push the brake pedal less. Now, the reason brakes stop working is because they overheat and expand, and the brake material cannot brake properly. So we need to keep the brakes cool. So one of the theory test questions is, you're going down a steep hill, you notice your brakes aren't working. Should you go down a gear, up a gear? You want to go down gears. That kicks up the revs, that gives you engine braking. That means you can then take your foot off the brake pedal because the engine is controlling the speed of the car. That in turn cools the brakes because you're not using them anymore, and so then when you reapply the brakes, they come back again. One of the questions is about a ford. Now a ford is a road where a river flows over the road itself. You often get a marker point that shows you how deep the water is. And if you take your wheels into the road, of course they're going into a very deep puddle. Two types of brakes on a car, one that clamps like this, and another which is a disc and a drum, which basically is a bowl with discs that push the outside edges, so it goes like that and it tries to brake rather than clamping something from above. If you have this type of brake with a bowl and you go into water, this is going to fill up with water, and then when you put your brakes on, it's full of water, so you don't brake very effectively at all. And this is why the theory question is, you've gone through a ford, what should you do next? The answer is apply your brakes, dry them off a bit. You've got to try and squirt the water out, warm them up, turn it into steam, do whatever you want to do. Basically try the brakes to get rid of that water out of the bowl, and then you can continue driving along the road. So always try your brakes after you've been through a ford. I hope that helps. Lovely to see you, darling. Lovely to see you.